I'd like to tell you about a revolution in medicine and biology, which is about to happen. Medicine typically treats patients as average patients, not as individuals. You carry out clinical trials on large and often necessarily heterogeneous groups of patients, and therefore the drugs which are selected are really statistically best for the group, but not for the individual patients. In fact, it's well known that adverse drug effects are one of the most common causes of death. For example, in the US, it has been published in JMA in 2000. Healthcare costs continue to rise, strangulating economies. The credit rating of nations will, to a large extent, also depend on the development of healthcare costs, as described, for example, in an article in the Financial Times. Pharma development costs are skyrocketing, endangering an entire industry. And ICT developments have been strangely absent from medicine and biology. They are obviously used, but not really to the extent we have to use them to improve those areas. So personalized medicine is data-driven, computation-driven. We have a number of facts. We have aging population in many countries of the world, particularly in many countries in Europe, as the cost to cure increases, so we cannot afford the health care even at its current status in the long run as populations age. Health reimbursements decrease, less and less of the necessary and available medical treatments can be afforded by the healthcare systems. We have more and more of a transition from acute to chronic diseases and bottlenecks in many value chains, ICT, drug development, diagnostics, prevention, nutrition, medical devices, sensors. So there are many components which we have to combine to improve the situation, which can be developed in that flagship project we have been proposing. So health data digitalization is an important component. We have to reorganize healthcare to take care of the new possibilities. We have to integrate a large amount of data which can be generated on every patient. We need standards. We need an ICT systems infrastructure and more efficient ICT architecture and data security, privacy, and ownership to provide a solution. Now, a particularly dramatic case is cancer. Cure rates for many common forms of cancer have hardly changed. We have a high number of non-responders to cancer drugs. The typical response rate, the average response rate to a cancer drug is 28%, which means that 72% of the patients prescribed expensive drugs are actually getting more sick than they would be otherwise. Cancer drug development at the same time becomes more and more expensive. We have increasing number of cancer cases, roughly 12.5 million worldwide, roughly 3 million in Europe alone every year. That number is going to double till 2030, so worldwide we expect 26 million new cancer cases every year. Cancer research has increased in funding fairly dramatically. We've probably spent $1 trillion since the beginning of the war on cancer. This is the accumulated total of the NCI funding alone. In fact, some of you might have heard the jokes that more people live of cancer than die of it. But this product of the research, like in many other areas, does not arrive effectively at the patient. And so the question is why? And the solution, in our view, is to do whatever we do whenever we are faced in any other area with a problem which is complex, and medicine is extremely complex. The biology of every cell is complex, expensive. I think I've shown you already that medicine is extremely expensive and dangerous, and the quote on the effects of drugs on the survival, I think, demonstrates that it's dangerous. So we propose integrated molecular, physiological, anatomical models of every individual in the healthcare system based on the integration of omics, biochemical imaging, lifestyle, and sensor data. So anything we can measure on a patient without harming him. As a basis of the data-rich ICT-intensive individualized medicine on the future, not just to develop personalized therapy, but that's obviously extremely important, as you saw from the cancer example, but also to develop truly personalized prevention to basically keep people healthy by taking advantage of the power of the individual models. We have the possibility to have an ICT revolution which could allow medicine to be truly personal, integrative, so models contain all different scales from the different cell types to the entire organism. Digital explanation-based, we take advantage of the enormous amount of results from basic research in developing the models, and efficient. This obviously has high impacts on many areas. ICT industry is one of them. We spend probably around $7 trillion in the OECD and BRIC country alone on healthcare. If you move 20% of that money into new ICT developments, you have an enormous market. Models have to be going from the cell. Diseases, many diseases are molecular diseases. Neurodegeneration is a molecular disease and is treated by molecular therapies, so drug therapies which interact with the molecules. And on the other hand, they have effects on the entire organism. There are different reasons why this now has just become possible. It has been quoted before that computing is the most rapidly developing field. We know, I can show you one which develops much faster. The left side of the slide shows you how we sequenced the human genome, ending roughly 10 years ago in a worldwide integrated effort for between $1 to $3 billion. So the first genome cost us $1 billion. We are just approaching now the time of the $1,000 genome, maybe sometime middle or end of next year, using machines of this type, while those machines analyzed 96 DNA sequences or 384 DNA sequences in parallel. This same machine now analyzes 1.2 billion DNA sequences in parallel. So the costs have essentially dropped by 1 million-fold since the Human Genome Project, and they are still dropping very rapidly. So if you compare that to Moore's Law, that's the development of sequencing costs over time till roughly 2005. And then there's this enormous drop in the cost of sequencing one genome and the commensurate increase in sequences of human genome. But that's not only true for sequencing. There are many other analytical techniques, the so-called omics revolution, which we use in the peak labs on research projects, and which we would be able to move into routine healthcare applications within the Flagship project. Now, we have two phases, a ramp-up phase in which we will concentrate on a number of diseases. So cancers, in particular colorectal cancer is interesting because it can be used for many of the different modeling approaches we use, but also other cancers, metabolic diseases, and the so-called orphan diseases. But in the full phase, we would obviously try to cover all of medicine and all of health by using the modeling. Now, this requires enormous amounts of computing power. This is a slide from Intel, who's also one of our collaborators, illustrating petaflop systems of today as a client and handheld systems 10 years later. 10 years give you roughly a 1,000-fold increase in computing power in high-end machines. Now we're in the petaflop range. 2018 or so, we will probably have exaflop machines available. So we go from medical imaging to genomics to personalized medicine. Now, to take advantage of this computing power, we do, as I said, what we do anywhere else. If we design a car, we smash thousands of virtual prototypes against virtual walls, for example, to crash test before we build any prototype. This has, among other things, critically contributed to reduce the development time for developing a new car in Europe from 5 years to 2 years. If you can imagine, if a pharma company could cut the development time for a new drug from 14 years, 12 to 14 years to 5 to 6 years by virtualizing large part of its development process, it would obviously revolutionize this area, particularly since patent protection extends for 20 years. So typically the pharma companies have 6 to 8 years left to sell their drug before they run out of patent. So would you fly an airplane if the airplane was not simulated first in a computer and tested in silico? Would you fly an airplane if the pilots were students learning how to fly? Would you go to a doctor who is not going to first model you and see how the therapy proposes will affect you? So computer models of biology are extremely complex compared to the weather. Weather is basically simple physical equations, but the weather is chaotic. Biology, we are not chaotic, otherwise we wouldn't be here to discuss it. So if you look at monozygotic twins, they are extremely similar, so there is no space for very chaotic phenomena in the development. Those have been evolutionarily selected against, and therefore a correct model representing the biological process will also be inherently stable. So for cancer, again, those are the models we are using based roughly on this $1 trillion of results from cancer research. Some of it, for example, you can read in Hanna and Weinberg, Hallmarks of Cancer, but a lot of it is obviously in databases and in the literature. So cancer therapies, as I said, average response rate 28%, 72% receive the wrong drug at first. 3 million new cancer patients each year, so Europe spends 3.5 billion euros per year in ineffective and potentially harmful drug treatments. If we say that building up the ICT and data-driven personalized medicine costs up to $1 billion, there's still a lot of money per year. If you look at all diseases, the drug costs worldwide are of the order of 800 billion, and if you assume conservatively half of those drugs are inappropriate, you are talking about an average payoff of 400 billion per year rather than of 2 billion. Now, if you use that, if you look at that particular case, which is fairly pragmatic level modeling, we have more than 12 million new cancer cases per year, which requires sequencing roughly 1 genome per second. Analyzing the genome costs maybe a few hundred core days, or 1,000 core days on a high-end machine. So if you want to model every patient in terms of prevention, every individual in Europe taking a patient represented as 200 different cell types, you want to analyze 500 different conditions, and you want to do that 1,000 times to get a statistical feeling for how good your recommendations are. We are talking about something like 10 to the 13 core years just for Europe alone, which would take roughly 10 times the whole electricity supply of the world if we do it the way we do it now. So I think it is not just a measure of buying more computers, and there are some interesting inverse problems which also have to be solved. So we have a number of different challenges. We have to unite the different communities which are at the moment not really talking to each other. That the pipelines which we, the different platforms, medical platform, analytical platform, infrastructure platform, medical Kurzsattler, organized Kurzsattler analytical platform. I'm doing infrastructure, hardware, software. Nora Benhabiles, who is here, and Oscar Menzer, data pipelines in Berlin from the EBI, computational methodologies, Mark Giolani, and ICT integrations. Hans Westerhoff is also here. So, and then there's coordination and management. We are using different modeling platforms because you use different modeling platforms to some extent for different diseases. For cancer, we know a lot about the mechanisms. Okay, there's enormous impact on the science and technology. We have, for example, enormous developments in the computing which could be triggered, and but also we have a basic research knowledge explosion driven by the widespread medical application. The enormous impacts on society, I've given you some of the numbers, and on the economy. We have a chance to reinforce European competitiveness, and in an area in which Europe is very well positioned, since they have a much better developed healthcare systems than, for example, the US. We have many partners in Europe, and can take advantage of many of the ongoing EU and international projects. We have this very good connections to all the infrastructure projects, appraise, and so on. We have at the moment 150 partners, roughly from 33 countries, 21 EU member states, 6 associated countries, 7 other countries. The number still keeps increasing. Roughly 1/3 of those partners are industrial partners. The structure is, for the moment, that of a framework 7 project with appropriate modifications, but in the full phase we will take advantage of structures which are being developed by the EU. CS innovation is an enormously important component of that project, and just as a summary, both ethically and economically, we cannot afford to not to switch to a new ICT and data-driven, duly personalized medicine and prevention. After all, we are all patients of the future in some form or the other. And that was the last slide.